Hello, spooky scholars. Welcome to another episode of Screamology. My name is Professor Nemo, and today is episode 2. We're going to be talking about the elements of horror and what makes horror movies successful in their genre. So I hope you like our chat today. It's actually going to be just me. I had some scheduling issues for my guest today, which is fine, but it ended up working out, so we got a good episode for you. We have some sound clips / video clips depending on how you're listening, whether you're on YouTube, there's going to be video clips with the sound, or if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music, something like that, it's just going to be sound for you. But we got some examples from some of the films that we're mentioning in the chat. So welcome. I hope you enjoy this episode and keep listening with us. We got a lot of cool stuff coming up. Hello, spooky scholars. Welcome to episode 2 of season 1, our Horror 101 season. And today we're going to be talking about a big question. The main question is, what is horror? And what are some of the elements of horror that really make the genre successful? So I don't have a guest today due to some scheduling conflicts, but I actually think it's better because this topic is pretty informational. So I think if we added in back and forth commentary and conversation, it might make the episode super long. So I just decided that this would work better for this week. But next week we will have another guest coming back, so don't worry about that. We'll have lots of questions and things to talk about. So on our next episode, we will be talking to Kendall Phillips, and we're going to be speaking about the origins of horror. So stay tuned for next week. We're going to have a great time talking about where did horror come from? Where did it start? How did it start? We're going to be talking a lot deeper into the eras of horror next season, which I'm going to be calling scaras, which I thought was kind of funny, but we'll see if that sticks. Anyways, let's get going on our episode 2 of Screamology. We will be discussing some of the elements of horror that make the genre successful. So let's get into it. So first of all, when we're talking about what is horror, last week Chuck and I briefly talked about what we think horror is. Chuck mentioned that it basically is anything that takes you out of your comfort area, and often it makes you feel unsafe, like while you're watching the film. And my thoughts are that horror films are designed to create fear and unease in its viewers, and so an interesting aspect of horror is its many ways to create those feelings in its audience. And that is what we're going to be exploring in this episode right here. So let's get going. These are the elements of horror and horror storytelling. Once we really dive deeper into this topic, you can see that often these elements work together in tandem to successfully scare you, or at the very least, they make you feel uncomfortable and uneasy. So I just think it's very interesting how this all comes together, and I want you guys to know about it too. Just a quick heads up also, I will be keeping this episode as spoiler-free as possible because I will be going into deeper depth about them later down the line, so I'm going to keep the examples pretty brief. But I do suggest watching any of these films if you haven't seen them, but even revisiting some of them if you have, because really, honestly, all of them are really great. So they're fun movies, great to watch. So the first thing I want to talk about in terms of the elements of horror is the atmosphere. And now this section is going to be the most in-depth most likely because the atmosphere is really what brings horror together and causes us to have these feelings of fear and anxiety and uneasiness and dread. So I think that one's really important for us to understand and to understand all the different aspects that go into it. So atmosphere is really one of the first things that helps us understand the environment that we're going to be living in for the next hour and a half or 2 hours, and it's often established during the first act of the film. It's here that the director can use different techniques to draw us into the film. Sometimes they might show us a sneak peek of the terror to come, but other times maybe it's keeping us out of the loop so as not to ruin like a big reveal or a jump scare that's going to finally bring us into the real horror. So there's different ways to do it, and sometimes they're successful, sometimes not. It really just depends on the actual film. A big part of the aesthetics of the film create an atmosphere to draw us in, yet make us feel uneasy and on edge. Some examples of ways that filmmakers establish atmosphere are through a combination of both visual and auditory techniques. So some examples of visual effects would be the lighting, the setting itself, color palettes, and also cinematography and camera work. Some examples of how films use auditory experiences to build atmosphere are through the use of sound effects, the use of music and score, and also, surprisingly, sometimes the use of silence in the right spot. Lastly, we have some other ways of creating atmosphere that don't necessarily fit in either of those two categories. So one big one is jump scares, and that's kind of actually because it's a combination of visual and auditory. And I read somewhere that the sound effects in jump scares are actually the most important part of it because our brain understands the sound before we see what's happening. So those two things need to go together for the jump scare to be really effective. So surprising plot twists can also create fear and dread, and it leaves questions unanswered or up to the viewers to interpret. And generally having ambiguity, which can be found throughout the plot, it's often a way to end a film and leave the audience guessing and questioning what actually happened, what did we really see, and what's really the ending? Is there a conclusion here? So when you have those kind of things, it really leaves the movie ending, and sometimes throughout the plot, it leaves you as the audience a way to kind of interpret it yourself. And so the fun part about that is maybe everybody has a different interpretation of the film, especially when some things are left ambiguous. It doesn't give you a clear, this is what happened, this is what the ending means. It's really up to you to come up with that for yourself. So I think that's always fun. I actually like that in movies. And lastly, another aspect about creating atmosphere is creating characters that the audience loves or hates. It kind of works in different ways. So if you love the characters, you're going to have empathy for them and you're going to feel really bad when something happens to them or almost happens to them. And in contrast, if you build characters that the audience hates or they're annoying or irritating, I think that works especially well in slashers because obviously you're like cheering for the people to die, or when they die, you're cheering. Unlike when you have empathy for them, you're like, oh, dang, I kind of didn't want them to die. So that's another interesting part of creating atmosphere. And another thing that's very often found in horror movies, horror literature, and other horror things is the use of symbolism. And sometimes it can be subtle, and other times it could be very obvious, but either way, I really love symbolism in horror films because it makes the movie feel as though they have a lot more depth and a deeper meaning. And sometimes I have fun trying to figure out, like, what does that mean? What is the metaphor here? So that's fun, and I do like that in horror films. What do you guys think? Do you like symbolism, or does that make it too complicated for you? I think that might kind of depend on what kind of movies you really like. So if you're really into slashers, I don't think you're looking for like a deeper meaning. But if you really like psychological horror, you might be looking for deeper meanings and metaphors and that kind of thing. So I guess that kind of depends what you like. So underneath the atmosphere, let's go a little bit deeper into the categories that I just listed. We're just going to go in chronological order of what I just told you guys about, but we're going to start off with lighting techniques. So color palette is a very big part of this idea, and in fact, in a few short weeks, we're going to be having an episode all about the use of color in horror films. It's going to be really interesting. I'll be chatting with Professor Murray Leader, who wrote an entire chapter about it in his book titled Horror Film, A Critical Introduction. And I did read that chapter before speaking with him. It's a very good chapter. It's a very good book. I actually finished his book a couple days ago. And if you're really into horror, I highly suggest it. It's really great. It's very informational. And Murray is really cool. So keep an eye out for that episode coming up. We will be talking about all things color theory and also do a quick overview of two movies that are hugely dependent on color to give us a certain experience. And don't worry, we're going to be doing in-depth reviews of those movies also later down the line. And so in that episode, we're also going to be keeping spoilers down and, very brief plot summary and all that kind of stuff. So don't you worry, we'll talk about it deeper later on. So with lighting, we can analyze colorful lighting, but another aspect of it is the amount of lighting or lack thereof. Depending on the lighting situation in horror films, they often employ shadows and how much or how little we see of them. The use of shadows can create a sense of dread, especially if us as the audience can see shadows coming up behind a character and the character cannot see it, and so that's giving us kind of suspense or tension of like, oh my God, the monster is coming and the person doesn't even know. And so I think that's very useful to create, an atmosphere of dread and kind of anxiety. Like, when are they going to pop out? Are they going to pop out? Are we just going to know that they're behind them? So I think shadows are very important in horror films. Sometimes we see scary monsters or people slowly emerging from the darkness, which can also create really spooky vibes as we go through the story. In the film Suspiria, which is one of the films we're going to talk about with Murray, the movie uses colorful lighting to give us a sense of uneasiness and strangeness, an almost dreamlike aesthetic. And the colorful lighting, as it changes, it can even alert us to possible things happening soon or give us a certain emotion that's tied with the current scene. As a reminder, we'll be going much further in depth about color use in horror movies in a few short weeks, so keep a lookout for that. So a couple other examples of lighting in horror films is, first and foremost, The Shining. You're going to find that The Shining is popping up as an example in a lot of these categories because it uses a ton of elements of horror all mixed together to really make a horror masterpiece. I love The Shining. A lot of people, not everyone, but many people, it's their favorite horror movie, and for good reason. So in the film, The Shining uses lighting and shadows to create a feeling of unease as the movie goes on. Kubrick also uses the light from below technique, which is a common style of lighting in horror when they light from below and it creates kind of weird shadows on your face that are spooky. Kind of like when you're a kid and you put the flashlight under your face to tell a scary story. So that's used a lot in horror movies as well. So it's very effective.
Here's Johnny.
So horror movies totally use lighting to mess with how we see things, build up tension, and makes those scares hit just a little bit harder. Shadows, colors, and where the light's placed all work together to pull us into the creepiness and really amp up the fear factor. Next, let's talk about our next visual technique, which is the horror setting, and that really builds the atmosphere that we're going to be experiencing. So I think this one is also very important because certain settings are just more creepy than others. So, some examples of that would be like an abandoned hospital, deep in the woods, somewhere isolated. Let's see, in a barren desert perhaps, any type of really setting for the movie, it's gonna really impact what we're feeling. Are we scared from the beginning? Do we descend into something scary? So that's important. It's gonna contribute to fear and dread in the film, sometimes from the get-go, other times really like slowly getting us there. Again, I'll bring up some examples for you, and the first one is unsurprisingly The Shining. Like I said before, I really love this movie, and I think it really successfully uses a myriad of techniques to create an incredibly terrifying atmosphere to me from the get-go. But then it gets more and more scary as we go, so, I really love that movie. So this film really gives us the feelings of isolation, which is scary to most people, including myself. And again, from the beginning, there's the top-down view of them driving their car up the windy road up to the overlook hotel. And even that to me is just screaming isolation. We're going high up into the mountain. Well, I don't know what's the mountains, but into the middle of nowhere. And so that's just from the get-go, it's really showing you, okay, we're going to be isolated. And even when the hotel workers are like, okay, we're leaving for the season. Bye. Thanks for watching it for us. Again, that's showing us, isolation, and no one's going to be here to help you. And, it's going to be snowing. You're going to be snowed in and all this stuff. So That is creepy. I hate thinking about like what if you were somewhere and then no one can help you, you're far away, nothing can be done if something bad happens. Another example that I think really works for that is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's using the desolate and kind of rural setting to again, elicit feelings of isolation and vulnerability and just the fear that comes with that.
Oh, he's weird looking. No.
Another fun horror setting is the haunted house. And that's a little bit more of like a classic setting. We see that from early horror films up until modern day. And so I think it really employs the setting specifically for this one to really create the atmosphere of fear, spookiness, something's wrong, there's creepy noises, all that kind of stuff. And to be honest, I don't really think I need to go super deep into detail about that because if you like horror, I'm pretty sure you've seen a haunted house. Even as a kid, there's haunted house movies, kid friendly, of course, but we all kind of know the concept of that one. But I do think that the cobwebs, the dark lighting, the cool tones, labyrinthine corridors, they all make for a perfectly anxiety-inducing setting. So for me, I did come up with a couple examples to just write. I'm sure most of you have seen them, but if not, check them out. If so, revisit because I love them both. For adult examples, we could say The Conjuring and also the Amityville Horror. And I really suggest watching both versions of Amityville Horror if you want to, but I think the original is actually better. That one's from the 70s. So I would check it out if you haven't seen the original. You might like it better than the remake if that's the only one you've seen. Another thing we talked about a little bit before, but the color palette is going to make us feel things. And a lot of times color is very intentional, not only in horror films, but just film in general. There's a reason why this frame or this scene is this color, and these items are this color, and this person's clothing is this color. So that's why I'm excited to talk about color with you guys in a couple weeks. One of the things about color is that if you're using desaturated and muted tones, that already feels kind of creepy, a little bit uncanny and weird. Like we're used to seeing saturated colors a lot during, everyday life. But if tones are kind of darker, cooler, and especially desaturated, that's giving us a feeling of like it's nighttime. You might not be able to see all the details, which also ties into, the fear of the dark. There might be something kind of in the shadows, but you sort of can't tell because everything's sort of the same value of color. So that really helps with horror films. On the other side of that, which I guess not a lot, you might not think about it unless you know, but another thing that can cause us like an uneasy feeling is when colors are not natural to what we're expecting to see. So, again, in Suspiria, there's colorful lighting situations. There's all the rooms are like weird primary colors, very saturated, which you would not expect to see like in a building. So, that kind of brings like an uncanniness to possibly the scene or even the movie as a whole. So again, that's color making us feel something, whether it's desaturated or saturated. So again, examples of color palettes in horror that are successful is, like we said before, Suspiria. That one also is going to come up in a couple different categories. And then the other one that I always think of first is the remake of The Ring, which is one of my favorite movies. And if you've been following the podcast already, you already know that one of those scenes has stuck with me forever and ever and still scares me to this day. So, anyways, getting back to that, The Ring has a very cool toned blue palette throughout the entire movie. And surprisingly, so it is set in the Pacific Northwest, and there's a lot of gloomy weather and stuff there. So I feel like that film palette, it does kind of also give us like the setting of where the movie is placed. And then also, even if you didn't know that about the Pacific Northwest, that blue color is creepy and weird and gives you a very like anxiety, like it's an eerie feeling just throughout the whole film. It's very unnatural feeling. So I think that it works well also. And then another film that has an interesting way of looking at color is called The Mask of the Red Death. It does star Vincent Price, so if you really love him, I would check it out if you haven't already. But color is very important for that film. And it's again another film I will be talking to Murray later about. So check us out in a couple weeks for that episode. So I think that's the end of kind of our visual techniques that we're going to go over. The next thing we're going to talk about is audio techniques and audio experiences. So horror successfully and often uses music and score to really set the tone, set the atmosphere. It really makes certain scenes more scary. And also the lack of score sometimes, and the silence, it really builds up the tension with silence because you're like, is something about to jump out at me? Is there going to be a loud music sting or something that's coming up? So I think that having a balance of the score, the sound effects, and even the silence really is going to make a film very successful, or maybe not if it's not employed correctly. So again, interestingly, in a couple weeks' time, we'll be talking about sound design, and I'm very happy to announce that I'm going to have Disaster Piece here with me to talk about sound design, and he was the sound designer. He did the score as well in It Follows. Now, if you haven't seen It Follows, go do it. It's such a great movie, and it's amazing. I love it. I loved it. It's an interesting concept. It's an original concept that I myself had never seen that concept in a previous movie. I'm not sure if it's the first one to do it, but I highly suggest it. The atmosphere is eerie. It's dreamlike. The colors are interesting. The horror, I'm not going to say anything to spoil anything. The horror is interesting and anxiety inducing for sure. But again, look for us in a couple weeks' time for the sound design episode. It's going to be really great. It's going to be a really fun chat. So, and I'm not sure Chuck might be joining us that day, just depending on scheduling. So what do you guys think about creating atmosphere in a horror film? Do you think it's a big part of whether or not they succeed in what they're trying to portray? Let me know in the comments below. Lastly, are uncategorized ways of bringing in atmosphere. Ambiguity is a big one. As Chuck and I talked about briefly last week, the less you show of the monster, the scarier it will be. So your imagination will almost always be much scarier than what is eventually revealed. And for me, I think that's a really successful way to keep the audience on the edge of their seat. Sometimes, for me anyway, I almost feel a sense of relief when I finally see what it is that has kept me in an endless loop of anxiety. Like we said, usually your imagination's going to be scarier than what you end up seeing. So I feel like a weight's lifted off my shoulders once I find out what it is. Next, jump scares, of course, are very successful in also keeping us wondering when the next scary thing will appear. And overall, it keeps us scanning the entire frame in certain scenes to make sure we're not missing anything or if we're seeing something in the background in anticipation of something jumping out or, a scary sound, something like that. And again, for these ones, I kind of don't think I need to find specific examples because most horror films are going to have some, questions of what's happening. Most of them are going to have stings of music or jump scares, so I think we all know about them. Another thing that horror films do is to subvert our expectations of what's going to happen. And I think something that's really successful is if you don't see the twist coming at all and you're completely surprised when it happens. So I think, again, I'm not going to put any examples here because why would I tell you, oh, this movie has a surprising twist? Then you're going to go into the movie already knowing there's a twist, trying to wrap your head around it. What's going to be the twist? You're going to be looking for it and you're not going to enjoy the movie for what it is. So I will be skipping any examples for that particular one. Lastly, for atmosphere, we're going to briefly mention symbolism. And again, sometimes I think symbolism is more prevalent in movies that have, deeper meanings and, different interpretations of things. I don't think you're really going to see much symbolism in a slasher movie. So my suggestions that I came up with were Hereditary, and I really suggest you see it if you haven't yet. Hopefully Chuck's watched it. He said he was going to try and watch it soon. So it's one of my favorite movies. So I really suggest that one. Another one with symbolism that I watched that I thought was totally weird, but it was interesting to watch was Mother, and it has an exclamation point at the end. I don't know if that helps with anything, but that one is very strange, and I think that's why there's so much symbolism in it, because it's kind of hard to interpret, but it makes you think anyways. The next one would be The Babadook, and that one is like really filled with symbolism and deeper meaning, and yeah, I mean, I love the movie, so I also suggest that one. And then the last one I have is an A24 film, and it's called Men. It's really weird. It's a very strange movie, but and to be honest, I actually had to kind of like look on Reddit what other people's theories are of what the movie meant and some of the stuff. So, uh, check that one out for yourself. It is weird, but I did like it anyway. So, and if you like trying to figure out what stuff means, it's a good movie for that. I don't know, you call it a trigger warning, but it is, there's some body horror in that one. So if you don't like body horror, maybe don't watch it. So finally, we finished up Atmosphere. I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on Atmosphere and how important it is for horror films. So if you want to, comment below this video. I believe I have comments turned on Spotify too. Or you can always shoot us an email, whatever you like. So next after Atmosphere is Suspense and Tension. So we're not going to go like super deep into these other ones because all these other ones really kind of tie into Atmosphere, but we still will briefly talk about it a little bit. So with Suspense and Tension, a successful horror movie that uses those is going to employ like an ebb and flow of suspense and a feeling of relief. And so one way I think that horror films are able to keep their viewers engaged in the film, not get bored or anything like that, is that there's going to be like a rising tension and anxiety and suspense until it reaches like a climax of sorts, and it's followed by a quick drop into a feeling of relief. Something pops the bubble of suspense and we get down like little couple scenes of, a daytime scene or something that's going to give us some like relief, like, whew, finished, thank goodness. But then the story's gonna have to start the process again. We're gonna start building up more tension, and boom, release. And I don't know if there's like a specific number of times that needs to happen, but yeah, it's a good way to keep everybody like kind of on the edge of their seats the whole entire time. And then another thing I think about it is that all these building of tension, release. Each time it builds tension again, it's going to get a little bit more intense. And then the final building of tension, usually in Act 3, and that, and is there a release at the end? We don't know, but it's going to be the most intense one as the movie's about to end. Typically. I guess not always, but most of the time. So this back and forth really keeps the movie moving along, and it keeps the viewer interested in what's going to happen next. And again, it's giving you kind of like a question: when is this going to happen? How crazy is it going to get before we get a little bit of release? But I think that is one way that movies can keep you going, keep you not getting bored, and keep you watching. So question for you guys: do you as horror viewers appreciate the growing tension as the films continue, or does it seem like too much for you? Would you like it to be a little bit more straightforward and kind of linear? So don't forget to drop your comments below, share your thoughts with us, or email us, whatever one you like best. But moving on to some examples of films that do this successfully are as follows. The Thing. I highly suggest to watch it if you haven't, but definitely do the original. The remake is alright, but the original is much, much better. And it really gives you the feeling of, tension where the characters don't know who they can trust, and that goes on through like the whole movie. So I think that one is great. I love that movie. The Conjuring is another one that's pretty successful with building tension. There's moments where you like think you're safe, such as like daytime shots, and maybe you won't be. I don't know. If you haven't seen it, check it out, and maybe you'll find out for yourself. Again, of course, one of the best movies, The Shining, and you really get a sense of tension building from the beginning to the end. We're descending. Actually, I don't want to say that. It's going to be a little bit of a spoiler. So from the beginning to the end, there's tension, and yeah, it's great. Halloween is another good example of this because for most of the movie, it's just a relentless stalking from Michael Myers, and it just, you're wondering what's going to happen. When's it going to happen? So I love that one. I think that's a great example as well for building tension. Another one would be Psycho, because it's a kind of a slow burn, but we're going to slowly get to know Norman a little bit better and see what his true colors are as we go through the film. So I think that's going to build a lot of suspense as well. And of course, Alfred Hitchcock is like the king of suspense. So you can almost always guarantee you're going to get some tension building in his films. My next example is Jaws, and really for that one, the suspense is built up by the theme song. And, anyone who's seen that movie, especially if they go swimming right after, but you're thinking in your mind that dun dun. So, that's really building suspense because it's like, okay, I'm hearing the music. It's the shark's probably coming. Is it going to come? When's it going to come? When are we going to see the fin? So, that's a great one. And then 2 more examples. First one being Silence of the Lambs. Again, amazing movie. You need to watch it if you haven't. Revisit it if you have. But there's a lot of tension building, especially as we're getting like jump cuts between different locations, but things that are happening at the same time. And so that really gets you going. And then lastly, as another movie we already just mentioned, but It Follows. Again, there's relentless nature of the horror. Again, I'm not saying what it is, but it's a relentless, continuous, like it's never stopping, and you're always questioning when it will appear and all that kind of stuff. So that movie is amazing. Oh, lastly, I forgot there's one other one. The original Haunting film, it is from the 60s. It's black and white, and you might think it's not going to scare you, but it actually uses, lighting and sound design to really make you feel scared. We're going to pretend the remake of that doesn't exist. It's actually no good. It's no good. But the original, even though it's a movie from the 60s, I was feeling, anxiety while watching it. So very good, very good. Definitely, suggest watching any of these movies. So the next thing we're going to talk about as an element of horror is a fear of the unknown. And this one I think is kind of one of the most common fears that is exploited by horror films. When you don't know what the true horror is, and we talked about this a little bit last week, and how, there could be a dark doorway, and there's going to be some long shots, and things are obscured in darkness and shadow, and, especially with the long shots, you're just growing suspense, like, okay, what is in the doorway? Is there anything in the doorway? It's taking a really long time for us to get there, so I'm like freaking out. Is something going to pop out at me? And so I think that's an important part of a successful horror movie is, you don't know what's outside the frame. You don't know what's in the shadow. You don't know if there's someone behind you. And that works a lot with like POV shots because now you're putting yourself in the shoes of the character, possible victim, and you don't know, is there something following you? Is there something behind you? Another technique I think they use successfully for that is when you give the person like a flashlight, and you really have now tightened up the space of what you can see, and there could be something on the sides, and you're always going to be wondering like, okay, they're doing the flashlight, and when is it they're going to land the flashlight on like something scary, or something's going to jump out. So I love all that stuff. It really helps with horror and making it successful in scaring somebody. So what are your thoughts? Do long shots and questions of what you're really seeing like affect you during horror films? And so again, I think this is another characteristic that doesn't really need specific examples just due to the common nature of it in horror films in general. Next, we're going to be talking about death and the supernatural, and it's a very, very, very common theme in almost all horror movies, and mainly death is like pretty much in every single one. And so to me, I think it's interesting that there's so many different ways that death can be portrayed and used in horror films, and truly, most horror films do have some form of death within them. It could be gory and over the top, which is more obvious, or it could be difficult themes regarding mental health or trigger warning, suicide, or there's accidental deaths, or even more abstractly, there's like the physical iteration of death in analogies and metaphors. It could be a person that's death. It could be, I don't know, something else that represents death. But so we see death everywhere. Another successful scare tactic is the supernatural. It's not something that we encounter like in our daily lives, hopefully anyway. But it just causes anxiety knowing that the monster doesn't have any, reality or realistic justification for why it exists. Why is it like that? What is it? Why does it have a weird behavior? And of course, this can go back to film aesthetics. as well, because we often see weird or scary imagery that we know is not realistic, but then that makes it kind of more scary because you're like, I don't know, this is weird, what is it, and why is it, and all that stuff. And of course, this is in most horror films, so we really don't need to dive deeper on this one. Next, we've got vulnerability and isolation, and horror successfully and often plays on our fear of being vulnerable or isolated. Many films that are set out in the middle of nowhere are going to give us a sense of isolation and no hope to escape some awful fate. Also, as humans, similar even to animals, we don't really like to be vulnerable. We want to be strong and confident and not scared, but that is typically easier said than done depending on the situation. So a movie I recently watched, actually last night, was The Rule of Jenny Penn. It's a very strange movie, but I actually really loved it. And this one really plays on vulnerability and loss of control and kind of being trapped. So one of the main characters, played by Jeffrey Rush, had suffered a stroke and was put into a care facility with a number of other elderly side characters. And due to this stroke, he kind of had limited ability to move and even to talk sometimes. And, the other elderly characters are being kind of like physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically tortured by another patient who's played by John Lithgow. Both of those main characters are such great actors, and they did amazing in this movie. And it turned out great, and just enough of the supposed monster was shown, and so I think it worked so well. It definitely plays on vulnerability here. And so some other good examples are The Thing, kind of not, there's isolation there. They're in Antarctica at a isolated base. And again, they don't know who to trust. So, being isolated and not knowing who you can trust is kind of freaky. I wouldn't want that for myself. The Conjuring, The Shining, of course, again, with, the isolation of being up in the overlook. Halloween, again, the relentless stalking is kind of like a vulnerability thing. So what do you think? Does the idea of vulnerability or isolation get to you? I'd like to hear what you guys think. Next, we're going to talk about the distortion of the familiar. And so this is when things start to get uncanny and weird. And this style is one that actually really gets me when I'm watching movies. It introduces a feeling of anxiety, distrust of your own surroundings, maybe even distrust of your family or friends. And it questions your own sanity. When you see something, it is well known in your mind that that thing doesn't belong there. That's kind of what that's about. So there's, there could be distorted faces, non-traditional color palettes, overly dark hallways and rooms, and that can really give viewers like a justified but scary sense of the uneasiness, uncanniness. And if we experience some of this aspect super strongly, certain scenes or even full movies can affect you for the rest of your life, and you'll always remember it. A good example of this is the Final Destination series and its lasting effect on our daily life. When you see a lumber truck, no matter how busy the traffic, you can see that there's not a single car directly behind it. And the idea of the lumber barreling out of the truck to impale you in your car has stuck with anyone who has ever enjoyed the franchise. It almost seems like it's pop culture at this point. Another example would be a clown not at a circus, which is where you would think you'd see them, such as Pennywise. And something under your bed or behind the door. These things will take away all your feeling of safety, possibly in a place where you feel love and would usually be able to trust that nothing is going to happen to you, or pop out from the shadows. Slender Man is another example where it's a human-like figure, but not how you would expect it to be in reality, like with no face and super tall. And then zombie films are also a distortion of the familiar because they are, or rather they were, humans, but now they're quite different. So next we're going to talk about shock and gore, and if you listen to episode 1, you know that my co-host Chuck is not a huge fan of over-the-top, unnecessary gore, as opposed to me, who usually enjoys it a lot. But don't forget, guys, it doesn't matter what you like or dislike. You are allowed to have your own opinions, and everyone deserves to be able to enjoy what you like or skip what you're not into. And this is going to always be a judgment-free zone here on the podcast and even in the comments and the Discord in the future, so don't worry, we'll take care of you. No one is ever going to judge you for what you like. And that should be the same even when you're out with your friends or whoever you're watching movies with. A lot of times when I'm watching a less serious or psychological horror film, I just have so much fun with all the fun and ridiculous, but also over the top gore and kills, because at that point it's just kind of entertaining. It's not really like, something to think deeply about. And of course, my favorite example of shock and gore is definitely the Terrifier series. The gore is way over the top and it's completely unnecessary, but I can't get enough of it. I just love watching those films. When it comes to shock, I think that the Saw franchise is a good example, but we can definitely get shocked by something overly intense or extreme body horror as well. And we're kind of just shocked by just how much pain and horrific circumstances our bodies can go through. Hopefully not in real life, of course. Some examples of the unhinged body horror would be Tusk or The Substance. And those will really shock you. And then coming back to gore, of course, Terrifier, but there's a lot of B horror, like Hatchet, for example, that also does this type of, style, and a lot of people like it. Often the films are not really plot heavy, but more simply for the gore factor. So what do you guys think? Are you into over-the-top gore or like really unhinged body horror, or are you completely turned off by it? Let me know all your opinions in the comments below. Send us an email. However you want to go about it, we appreciate hearing your thoughts and feedback. All right, everybody, so that's the end of episode 2 of our Horror 101 season. I hope you enjoyed what you learned today, because when we're talking about the elements of horror, we're going to be using those things to help us analyze movies going forward. So I really appreciate you listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Stay tuned for episode 3. We're going to have our guest Kendall R. Phillips with us, and we're going to be talking the origins of horror. So our big question that we're posing to ourselves, to you guys, is what was the very first horror film? And we're going to go through the different contenders, and we are going to talk about it, analyze it. By the end, we're going to come up with our own answer, and by the end, I hope you've come up with your own answer, and I want to hear from you. What do you think the very first horror film is? Thanks for creeping it real with me. See ya.